contrary to long-held myths, it does take money to create new music. As the traditional revenue streams have dried up, most notably in the overall decline of record sales, it has placed stress on who continues to benefit from the old models. The future demands new partnerships and a rethinking of long-held practices about how artists should be compensated for their music. The hallmark of any great entertainment career is sustainability. Recognizing both the significance of the author and performer in the music-making process helps to create those future opportunities.
Welcome to episode 37 of the Hipsters United podcast. My name is Chris, and joining me this week are Jason.
Hey.
Jill.
Hello.
And a special guest, Pins.
Hello.
And he's joining us this week to talk about the business issues that have been so well discussed this past week. But before we get started, I wanted to do some initial clarification. Billy appeared before House Committee on the Judiciary on Tuesday, March 10th as part of a hearing on a proposed Performance Rights Act. And we'll talk about what that act means in a moment, but I wanted to stress that this is a completely separate issue from the Ticketmaster LiveNation merger, which is being considered by the Congressional Committee on Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights. And there's been some confusion both among fans and the press, because Billy's been involved in both issues, that somehow those two are related, but they are separate issues with separate committees. And we may be discussing Billy's position in one and how it relates to his position in the other on the show today, but I wanted to make sure to stress before we get started that they are totally separate. So first off, let's talk about the Performance Rights Act. Jill's prepared a little description of this one, so why don't you take it away, Jill?
Okay, great. So I did a bunch of research on the Performance Rights Act this week, and basically I'm going to start off from the top. In late 2007, Senators Patrick Leahy and Orrin Hatch and Representatives Howard Berman and Darrell Issa introduced legislation that would end the exemption of terrestrial radio stations from copyright law, which requires satellite radio, cable radio channels, and internet webcasts to pay royalties, to pay basically, a fee to air any sort of content. The act would require them to pay the terrestrial radio stations to pay a royalty for the use of sound recordings to level the playing field with respect to these other sort of new media broadcast venues. So the proposed legislation would give these over-the-air broadcast stations the ability to use a statutory license and make one payment annually under a government-set rate for all the music that they play, instead of having to negotiate with every copyright owner for each use of music, similar to like the ASCAP, the ASCAP rights. So basically, since that time, since the act was proposed in late 2007, the act has been under consideration in the subcommittee on the courts, the internet, and intellectual property. So one of the things I've been hearing a lot from people is what precisely is the dollar value at stake under this act? And the answer to that question is that small commercial radio stations would pay $5,000 flat rate a year, non-commercial radio stations would pay $1,000 per year, and stations that make only incidental uses of music, such as talk radio stations, would not pay for music. Religious stations, religious services, all of that stuff would be completely exempt from paying this fee. So this, as Chris was talking about earlier, and we've been talking about on the blog a lot this week, this is strictly for performers of music, not for the composers or authors of music. And one of the questions that I had looking at this particular issue was, how much do the composers make now? How much do the actual authors of music make right now if the performers are not getting a cut of that? So the answer to that question is sort of historical. I referenced earlier ASCAP, or the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. This was an organization that was founded in 1914 by artists such as Irving Berlin and John Philip Sousa, who you may remember from, junior high band class.
You may remember him from such marches as...
Exactly. So this society was created before the invention of radio to protect the rights of composers. And now it's evolved after our, the advent of radio and other actual performance-related technologies. The society monitors public performances of music, whether via broadcast or live performance, and then compensates accordingly. So ASCAP collects licensing fees and then distributes them back to the members as royalties. To give you an idea of like how many, what dollar figure we're talking about at the top level, in 2005, ASCAP collected $750 million in licensing fees and distributed $646 million in royalties back to its members. So it operates at about a 15% royalty cut, royalty cost, overhead cost. So ASCAP is probably the largest of these organizations, but ASCAP also has a couple of competitors that operate on this royalty licensing fee model. BMI is another, and SESAC, or the Society of European Stage Authors and Composers. So that tells you like how much money these guys are raking in at the top. But from an individual artist perspective, the royalty calculations are based on a system of credits. So they weight different factors in order to come up with a song's total credits and a fair royalty calculation. So they take into consideration things like type of performance, if it's a theme, if it's an underscore, if it's promotional material, a song that's featured and sung by a recording artist on TV or radio gets more weight than one was played as background music during a radio commercial. So then the licensee, the radio station, the TV station, is also weighted based on a licensing fee, which reflects the number of the licensee's markets and the number of stations carrying the signal. So, NBC is going to garner a much higher credit rating, per se, than like Comedy Central, because it has a much larger distribution channel. So there's also a weight applied to this time of day in which the music was performed, especially if it's on TV or on radio or, like rush hour radio stations. So music played
during the morning drive.
Exactly, the morning drive. I wouldn't know because I ride the subway. So music played during peak times receives a lot more weight. So basically there's a very complex credit rating system that determines who gets the bulk of these shares. So once these credits are weighted, the total number of credits of all songs like in the universe being performed or aired is multiplied by the shares for the song, which is the shares the shares basically represent the distribution between the composer and the publisher, which means like, if the Smashing Pumpkins were still under a big label and they had a licensing arrangement with Virgin Records or so forth, the publisher would get a cut, and Billy Corgan would get a cut as the author of that song. So the complex credits are then multiplied by the relationship to the contract of the artist, and then they basically take the value of one credit of the huge pool of credits, and that's the entire, the total amount of money available for distribution in that quarter. So, for example, if there are 10 million credits for a quarter, and there have been $35 million of revenue collected for royalties that quarter, then the value of one credit would be like $3.50. So then they split that up. If you're an artist and you have 10,000 credits and each credit is worth X dollars, that's what your royalty payment becomes. And I actually remembered, we were watching the If All Goes Wrong documentary earlier today, and Billy Corgan states in that documentary that at the peak of their career, at the peak of the radio play, their songs were receiving 286,000 radio spins. He paused and kind of let that sink in. It was kind of amazing. That's a huge number. I'm not exactly sure what that translates to in terms of credits, but my loose guesstimate would be a whole hell of a lot. So I would imagine that they were making a pretty sizable or he was making a pretty sizable chunk off of radio play at that point in their career. So that's how they divide it up. The performers of the music have never been explicitly entitled to compensation, though they may have, additional contracts directly with their record label or with their band, mate or the composer of their music. So the Performance Rights Act, that particularly calls out, and it has in the hearings this week, that the only current instance in which artists that are performing songs, the only current instance where they receive royalties on that is when it's played in a digital arena, like on a webcast or satellite radio, is non-interactive, meaning that the listener, doesn't pick and choose their songs like they do on Pandora or Last FM, and the listener is a subscriber to the service. So the reason that people, the reason that artists receive royalties off of that type of information or that type of venue is because that was passed under the Digital Performance Rights in Sound Recordings Act of 1995, so almost 14 years ago that was passed. So that's the basis for this particular act. There are quite a few opponents of the Performance Rights Act. In particular, one is called the Local Radio Freedom Act, or it's also the House Concurrent Resolution 244. It's been signed by 104 members of the House of Representatives, and this, counteract promotes free radio airplay's promotional value and opposes the RIAA-backed fees on local radio. So that particular resolution, as an opponent, states that, and I quote, Congress should not impose any new performance fee, tax, royalty, or other charge relating to the public performance of sound recordings on a local radio station for broadcasting sound recordings over the air or on any business for such public performance of sound recordings. And the main tenet of this argument is that the fee that radio stations would have to be paying is a cost of entry limiter. So they don't want, independent radio stations to go out of business because they have to assess these other fees. And like Chris was explaining earlier, since Billy Corgan testified in support of the act, it's obvious that he's believing that they should be, artists should be paid fairly, not only for music they compose, but music that they perform on. And so he's part of a coalition called Music First with a ton of other artists, and they all are seeking to be compensated for radio station airplay. So, there have been plenty of notes available about the hearing on our live blog post that Jason did an awesome job of earlier this week. But the one thing that I thought was really, really interesting about this, and it speaks to sort of the sentimental heart of the matter, is what Jason transcribed from Politico's interview with him. So he says, I just wanted to read this for emphasis, "There's nothing worse to me than an elder artist who deserves to retire gracefully, who's forced back out on the road, maybe past their prime, because they're not getting the revenue streams they should have gotten. I believe it was Congress Lady Waters who brought up the point, or maybe it was Ms. Jackson Lee, about how many African-American artists were taken advantage of in the past, and that's a huge thing. So you can imagine some of these Motown artists, Stax artists from the past. So they never really got paid for creating what are great works of art in American culture, and they're forced into, different forms of poverty or having to do things that are probably beneath their station in life. And that's something that touches me very personally as a fan, particularly of older music. So regardless of, regardless of any argument you make that Corgan is supporting this right purely for self-interested reasons, clearly he and this other coalition are emphasizing the impact of the act for the entire music industry, allowing it to be, allowing artists to be much more self-sustainable. And that's the basic outline of the act. There are a lot of political forces at play, and I think that it's a really interesting situation. And much of what I've read so far speculates that it will be passed without a hitch, regardless of this contingency of more than 100 representatives who oppose it.
Yeah, I've been thinking about it this week, and I definitely think I would side with Billy on this one. Just because the main argument against it seems to be that, this is promotion for bands. So while the performers may not be getting directly compensated, they're being indirectly compensated, in that people hear the song on the radio and they go buy merchandise, they buy tickets to their concerts, and that they end up getting compensated as a result. but I think that argument breaks down when you look at radio stations whose format is oldies or classic rock, where these bands, they aren't performing anymore. Like, there's no... You can't say that they make up for it in ticket sales and merchandise. I mean, no one's going to buy... I think someone referenced the Temptations in the comments on the blog. No one's going to go buy a Temptations t-shirt because they heard their song on the oldies station. So, I think in that case...
Well, speak for yourself, Chris. Wearing one right now.
You clearly do not live in the hipstery parts of New York. Or Chicago, for that matter. No, I think you make a good point, and that's something that has been on my mind a lot this week, is that, these other sort of alternative format radio stations, not alternative format, but non-top 40, they're getting a free pass for what their content is. So, they're fairly, in large markets, they're fairly successful, and the artists are not seeing a dime.
Well,
if they want the right, if they're not the composers too. So
it seems odd to me that we typically think of there being an owner of a recording, and that owner has the right to sell it to Visa to put in its commercial or something, right? But apparently, the owner of a recording doesn't have standing with radio, only the songwriter. Am I wrong about this? So the songwriter writes a song, and then he could sell his rights, presumably, but
right.
The performers they have no... Do performers have... I mean, it seems like they have rights in all these other venues except radio. I mean, it seems like radio is the weird one, and this act just makes radio not weird. It makes it like everywhere else. Am I understanding that right?
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much the case. I think the one thing you're talking about in terms of like performers being able to sell songs, a performer who performs a song that they didn't write could still sell their version because it's their version, but the songwriter would still be getting royalties based on that being in a commercial. So if the Pumpkins wanted to sell Landslide or something like that, it's their recording. It's technically something they can sell, but if they do sell it, Stevie Nicks would still be getting, I believe, the credit. Like, I don't think the composer needs to have a sign-off on that because it's not their recording.
I see.
So it's seeking to level the playing field, like you were saying, Jason, that it is trying to, equate radio with TV play or, or internet radio. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think the one factor that you pointed out, Jill, is that pretty much every other form of music being played, whether it's satellite radio or online, those performances do get royalties paid. So what makes terrestrial radio any different? They're not any more promotional or less promotional in any case. And actually, nowadays, I would say probably a lot more people listen to Sirius or online web streams than they actually do terrestrial radio. Terrestrial radio is probably limited for a lot of people just when they're driving in their car. So it's, in my mind, it's almost even less promotional, which makes that whole argument that it's free promotion kind of go out the window to me, and it doesn't make any sense why radio should get a pass just for that reason.
Right, and I also think that the way that the current state of radio is formatted in regards to this issue encourages them to limit the songs that are on their current rotating airplay list. So, you turn on Hot 97.4 or whatever. I don't listen to the radio, so I'm terrible at giving you an example. But you turn on one of the hit radio stations in an urban market, and it is Chris Brown, Rihanna, Kanye, Chris Brown, Rihanna, Kanye. Like, it limits, since they're trying to attract as many listeners as possible, and there's really no sort of counterbalance measure to ensure that they can sort of play additional content, they're going with what's attracting the most revenue via advertising. And I don't know that this act particularly does away with that sort of incentive, but I would hope that these other smaller independent stations, because they're licensing, sort of a blanket fee to play whatever they want, that they would be able to be a little bit more or a little less choosy with what they're playing, or a little more diverse, I guess.
Jill, I was pretty disappointed when you read through your findings that, religious radio stations have for years been exploiting my mother's seminal recordings of Ave Maria and O Holy Night, and I'm disappointed that she's not going to see anything come out of this act for her.
She can go to Congress, testify.
Oh yeah, she's got a lot of sway.
Not a member of Music First.
I think she lives in Dan Burton's district, and they've stopped listening to him a long time ago.
So one of the other big arguments I've heard against it is kind of the argument of nostalgia that, if the radio stations are forced to pay this payment, this extra payment, they'll all go out of business.
Well, when the status quo changes, that just destroys the world.
But from what you were saying, Jill, it doesn't sound like the amount of money that they would be paying would really be all that unreasonable.
It's not, and furthermore, I think that the Act has been really intelligent in the way it's structured the payment. So part of the reason I read that hugely complex description of how ASCAP sort of collects its royalty monies is to demonstrate that this particular Act is saying, if you're a radio station, you got to pay us this particular amount of money, and then you can play whatever you need to.
It's not like you pay $5 every time you play the song. So
exactly.
Right.
So I think it's important from an artist perspective to think that, we're going to be getting paid something, but it's really not like an egregiously large sum. So, but,
I could understand the argument that some smaller, independent stations could have that be a factor. At the same point, I think a lot of these stations, both small and large, are suffering in the market in general. I don't think, one of the things that Billy was saying in the testimony was a lot about he grew up on radio. He doesn't want radio to die out, but part of the problem is it kind of has been dying out too. So while it could be an extra hit, especially on some smaller stations, I could understand that argument, but, there's ads, there's a lot of other ways to make money. I think part of the problem is radios have just been entrenched in this model, and as they've been losing market share to talk radio and things that people actually are tuning into more often now, they just haven't adapted to finding a way to survive in the first place. So part of the argument is, this is going to hurt us. And yeah, even though the money may not be a lot, it may hurt some. At the same point, they've been hurting themselves by not really adapting to their markets for the past 10 or 20 years too. Show of hands, how many people here listen to terrestrial radio all that much? When I'm in my car, if I don't feel like turning my iPod on, that's about it.
Right.
Well, I listen to Sean Hannity, and, it seems...
Does he play a lot of music in his show?
Well, yeah, I specifically thought, when Jill said talk radio was exempt, I was like, like that little tag when he plays Mouths of Babes every time they go to commercial. Pumpkins aren't going to see a dime from that.
Yeah.
Well,
it's a big loophole.
Yeah.
Another thought I've been having this week is also, I think that the argument is really apparent for radio stations that primarily have like oldie formats or sort of hard rock, older formats of music. But I think it's equally convincing for independent artists as well. So I think Billy has talked about this a little bit this week in interviews, where he's alleging that the number of great artists is reducing. And this, I think, is part of your disclaimer, Chris, where we talk about another aspect of the other legal proceeding not akin to what we're talking about right now. But he's been talking about how the rise of great artists is less apparent because of how the record labels are acting these days. And I think that one of the barriers of entry into radio markets and into greater exposure for indie rock bands is that sort of selectivity of radio stations to only play top 40 hits. So by that I mean, if there is a model that provides sustainable revenue to independent artists, like the Performance Rights Act, then it doesn't necessarily matter if you are a signed artist. This particular type of royalty payment system would allow independent artists to get paid too. if they're on, rotation at these independent stations. Did that make about as much sense as...
Independent cover bands are going to get rich now.
Well, I mean, right now, currently, as it stands, if you're an indie band, you're not signed to a label, no one's promoting you, but yourself. And let's face it, there are thousands of those right now. You don't have the weight of a big radio or of a big record label behind you. You're not receiving any compensation for airplay.
Yes, you are. You write your own songs.
Unless you're the composer.
Well, they are, though. I mean, that's why I make the crack about independent cover bands. I mean, what indie band doesn't write its own songs?
But they don't have. I mean, without getting too deep into it, I think that this also protects independent bands' revenue sources as well.
Yeah, no, I think it does, Jill. There are, like you said, not getting too into it because it delves into just the whole music business in general, but obviously there are a lot of indie bands that probably get moderate airplay on, NPR, independent stations, things like that, where they won't be getting those performance royalties, and that's something that can help them, when you're a small band that's only selling out maybe 500-person venues, trying to do a tour, that extra little bit of money can definitely help them sustain a career and help build to something a little more. It's definitely true.
And it can get you back into the studio.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it gives them a little extra revenue source besides touring that they can maybe rely on to, try to build more of a career.
Well, not to get too economic analysis on it, but I'm just kind of imagining that the performance rights, like the pool of revenue, I kind of imagine that it cuts into the songwriters' royalties somewhat. Because at some level, the radio station, what determines their revenue? Well, it's the advertising sales. Well, that's not going to change, right? I mean, the total revenue that the radio station is going to make is going to be the same. So where is the additional money to pay the performance royalties going to come from? Is it going to come straight out of profits? I kind of doubt it. I mean...
I doubt terrestrial radio is making too much profit these days.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, Congress would obviously have to adjust the other royalties, in order, if these royalties were to come out of the songwriters' royalties, Congress would probably have to make that call, but, that kind of seems like the sort of thing they would do. You know what I mean? Because, at the moment, Congress sort of sticks it to radio by passing this bill, it would seem like Congress might do something like, well, we stuck it to you, but instead of just adding on this, we'll, reduce the composer's royalties a little. You know what I mean? I mean, the total might be more than the total was before, but it might not be like you're just completely adding on this new thing, too. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I'm just not sure that this is, going to add a bunch of revenue for artists.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I don't know if Congress would have the ability to, I don't know if the composer royalty is purely between ASCAP and BMI and the stations, or if the government is involved in that calculation, but yeah, obviously the money is going to have to come from somewhere, and that's an argument that radio stations can definitely make. Either it's raising their ad rates or cutting into their profits or possibly cutting some services. I mean, there is a valid argument on the other side. It's not as simple as, performers should get paid, but there's, I think everyone, whether they're on one side or the other, understands the argument that Billy's making for artists' rights, but obviously it is a little more of a gray area than just a black and white issue. Yes, artists have gotten screwed, they should get paid. There are money issues and other complexities that need to be hammered out, so.
Well, and I think that it's a fallacy to assume also that a lot of your local radio stations are owned and operated locally. Clear Channel owns more than 1,200 radio stations, and it's a giant, corporate entity with plenty of bloat.
Jill, there was this station. There was this local station here I used to listen to, run by a guy named Jack, and I don't know. I think he ran it out of his basement. Jack FM, I think he called it.
Did you play what you wanted?
It was, I don't know. It was a big mix. Whatever. Jack had eclectic tastes.
I said, weirdly enough, in Chicago, there's a station I listen to that's run by this guy named Jack, and he plays what you want. That's what he says. So
wow.
Maybe it's a trend. Maybe they're cousins or something. I'm not sure.
Maybe it's Mr. Jack. So they're in the same family then. I never was clear on whether it was his first name or not. So.
Well, Jill, one of the things that you touched on there was Billy made some comments after the testimony. I think he talked about it when he he was asked some follow-up questions by the Congressional Committee, and he also talked about it a little bit on Politico. But he talked about this notion of stars and talking about how we've seen a decrease in the quality of the music that's out there, and he ties that in a correlation to the decrease in the number of new stars.
Mm-hmm.
This is where I kind of start disagreeing with Billy, because I think that's... I mean, he seems to be tying that to this bill, and I see it as totally unrelated. I think that the number of stars and the music industry as a whole's health is more related to kind of the rise of the internet and what's been going on in the entire industry, rather than as a result of performers not getting paid. Am I misreading what he's saying, or does that sound about right?
Chris, I'm sorry to cut off. You and I had talked about this, Chris, and I really think, Billy just kind of was taking the opportunity to talk a little and hear his own voice. Like at that moment, he brought up this thing about stars and the quality of music that is being made by the famous artists in society. And I don't think he made a good connection between that and the act. I think his point was interesting. I just think it was unrelated, Yeah. So I guess I agree with you on that point.
But I also think that I do agree that it's maybe a larger argument that he's making outside of the act, but I also think it goes back to what Jeremy and I were just talking about, in that, artists that have potential to be stars may not be getting that sort of support they need from an industry that's failed them, because those people that have proven success are the ones getting compensated accordingly. And the other artists, create one album, can't make ends meet, and then, create another band to make another new album to try to get another source of revenue or whatever. So
yeah, I think it's fair. Radio has broken artists and made them big stars before. It's not a foreign concept that he's trying to connect the two. I think there's a lot more going on, like you were saying, Jason, than just radio. But you have a case in point of a band like the Zombies in the 60s, who literally had broken up in Britain, and a radio DJ got their record in the U.S. 6 months later, loved the song, kept playing it, people started calling for it, and kind of took off. They had their biggest hit 6 months after they'd broken up, purely based on radio. So radio can have that effect. I understand the point he was going for, but I don't know how much relevance it has to, the current music market with the internet and the way that bands can obviously do a lot more self-promotion and reach a lot more people without radio being that bridge. So Billy's kind of talking about the future, but thinking about the past, and there's a big disconnect between those two, I think, right now, especially with radio.
Well, and the format of radio itself is not encouraging to real artistic achievement, as I think he's alluded to. Every single song right now that I'm hearing has that digital voice vocoder right now. It's exactly. It's basically, the radio has encouraged people to conform to a particular aesthetic, and I think because artists can't get paid for doing things that are, maybe more experimental, the quality of their potential output has declined.
Exhibit A, Chris Cornell and Timbaland.
Wait, what?
If you haven't heard, you need to go listen. It's probably the worst thing I've ever heard. Chris Cornell vocoder vocals with Timbaland beats. How that's not a number one hit, I have no clue.
Over under on Lil Jon remix. Gosh.
Well, I think that kind of dovetails into the next topic we want to discuss, which was the Ticketmaster LiveNation merger. And in this case, Billy did not appear before Congress. Instead, he just wrote a letter to the Committee on Antitrust, Competition Policy, and Consumer Rights regarding their deliberations on a proposed merger between Ticketmaster and LiveNation. And I think we're all pretty familiar with Ticketmaster as an online ticket seller and distribution system for all sorts of events, from sports to concerts. But I did a little research on LiveNation because I wasn't too familiar with that. And LiveNation does, I think from what I could tell on their website, they do some ticket sales online, but most of their ticket sale queries they send along to Ticketmaster already. And instead, LiveNation acts mostly as a concert promoter and kind of a record label, signing pretty big, already successful artists to huge multi-million-dollar deals, in which, for the most part so far, the artists retain the rights to their music, while LiveNation finances and profits from pretty much every aspect of their career, from touring to releases to even the band's website. And just to give some perspective on the types of artists they've been focusing on, announced deals so far have included U2, Madonna, Jay-Z, Shakira, and Nickelback. And these two companies have announced a merger that has been met with concerns of monopoly, and Billy's letter comes out in favor of the merger. And there are two relevant paragraphs to Billy's position, and I'll go ahead and read them here. So, quote Billy, "The system that was once the modern record business, essentially ushered in with the meteoric rise of the Beatles, is now helplessly broken, and by almost every account available, cannot be repaired. Personally, I would add to that a healthy good riddance, as the old system far too often took advantage of the artists as pawns, while the power brokers colluded behind the scenes to control the existing markets. This control often saw the sacrificing of great careers to maintain that control. Look no further than the major record labels' intense fight to slow down the progress of internet technologies that more readily brought music and video to the consumer because they couldn't completely control it. This disastrous decision on their part has destroyed the economic base of the recording industry. It is now a shadow of its former self. Artists now find a heavy shift of emphasis to the live performance side, and this is where this merger finds its merit. The combination of these companies creates powerful tools for an independent artist to reach their fans in new and unprecedented ways, all the while restoring the power where it belongs. In today's ever-changing world, the ability for artists to connect to their fans and stay connected is critical for the health of our industry. Without sustainable, consistent economic models upon which to make key decisions, it is both the music and the fans that suffer. In short, we have a broken system. This is a new model that puts power into the hands of the artist, creating a dynamic synergy that will inspire great works and attract healthy competition." End quote. Complicating matters a little bit is the fact that the CEO of Ticketmaster, Irving Azoff, also owns the firm that manages the Smashing Pumpkins, so I don't know, Billy doesn't seem to be the most impartial observer here. But forgetting that for a moment, Billy's point seems to imply that this deal is good for independent artists. Based on the deals that LiveNation currently has, I don't see much evidence that anyone but the biggest name artists will get a cut of this great synergistic money, and it seems to put a lot of power over the bands in the hands of LiveNation, the very thing that Billy has railed against in the past, and in this very letter, in fact. Jason, can you elaborate on Billy's point at all? What about this deal would benefit a band like, say, the Pumpkins, who aren't near the stature of Madonna or U2, but are, at this point, independent artists?
I'm going to defer to Pins. I think he knows more about this than I do. So.
Okay. Well, first, one caveat to the description you gave of LiveNation regarding their ticketing service, Chris, is roughly probably 2 or 3 years ago, LiveNation basically announced that they were going to start selling tickets. The whole idea behind that being we control, we own the venues, we're signing these artists to these deals where we control everything else. The only thing we don't control is the tickets. So they were going to create a ticketing system to basically, and obviously Ticketmaster, I should mention, has a lot of exclusive deals with venues, and that's how they kind of have their hold on the industry, which is what Pearl Jam fought against back in the 90s. So LiveNation is basically saying, well, the only thing we don't have is tickets, but if we control that, then we will own the venue, we will own the ticketing system, we'll have a cut in everything else of the artist. What will we need Ticketmaster for? So LiveNation actually was developing a ticketing system. Their first big rollout of it was, I want to say, in earlier January or early February this year, with Phish's reunion shows in Virginia this March. Apparently the ticketing system was not well developed at all. Tons of system crashes, a lot of angry people. Just the on sale did not go well at all. Strangely enough, 48 hours later, there's a Ticketmaster LiveNation merger proposed. Basically, LiveNation acknowledging that they don't have the capability to do that, so the next best thing is to merge with the company that does, so that they can control, all aspects of the touring regime. So, just wanted to mention that, because there is a reason that this merger came about when it did. With regards to Billy's letter, obviously, Jason and I have probably discussed this a lot of times, but looking at Billy as an independent artist, I don't know if I could fully use that terminology because of what you said. Yes, they are independent of a record label, but the company that manages them would have a vested interest in getting them into shows, or, they're not as independent in trying to work with the company as it would seem because of this, management ordeal. So it's kind of almost hypocritical stance to take to say this will benefit independent artists, synergy, blah, blah, blah. I read the letter, and a lot of what he's talking about is kind of railing against the record labels, which this doesn't have anything to do with. This is basically creating a large corporation that will control every large concert. Anything over roughly 5,000 people capacity is going to be controlled by LiveNation in some regard. I mean, it mostly already is, but this will force out a lot of independent promoters like Jam, which has been mentioned. That obviously, Billy and Jam have done a lot of shows in the Chicago area. How's that going to work out in the future with this kind of conflict of interest that Billy would have with LiveNation and Irving A. Bob and Jam? Like, it's putting a lot of coals to the fire that would have Billy saying, yes, we're independent, this will help us, this will help these independent artists. I just don't see that being the case.
Jill, did you have something?
Well, that was a really interesting comment that Jeremy just made. I have a couple of thoughts. First, I want to sort of re-clarify what you said earlier about the big name bands being the sole recipients of this. That's actually not true. A lot of those big artists are signed with what they call 360 deals. LiveNation controls every aspect of those particular bands' lives in return for the big, the mega bucks. They have the promotion aspect, the merchandising, the web. They're doing 360 degrees of work around the entire artist. But if you look at LiveNation's current artist list, there are lots, thousands of small artists that do have some sort of affiliation with LiveNation. And I'm guessing that it's usually around the promotional aspect of the ticket brokering. And to Jeremy's other point, I do think that in other... I can't speak for other venue or other sort of markets besides New York too much. I mean, maybe Chicago since I lived there for a while, but in New York, LiveNation does promote small shows too. So they're doing, venues like Beacon Theater. They're doing, the Fillmore. These are maybe 1,000-2,000 person venues. They're much smaller. There's even some of them in Brooklyn, like probably 500 person venues that I can see from their upcoming show list. So I'm not 100% I don't want to discredit the notion that LiveNation can't support independent artists as well, because I think that their structure, while they may be making lots and lots of money off of U2's hugely grossing tour, they also may be servicing hundreds of other smaller bands that do a pretty sustainable business and taking some sort of a cut of that promotional revenue as well. With that being said, what I would probably wager, and I'm sure this is where my totally inferior knowledge of economics will be corrected by Jason, I would imagine that vis-a-vis Jam Productions and a handful of other big local promoters here in New York, I would imagine that if LiveNation can fully service these independent artists without requiring that they go through these big 360-degree deals, and it's mostly, trying to get them to sell their tickets through LiveNation, I would imagine that same sort of promotional aspect draws in a lot of competition, especially from local companies trying to do the same thing. In New York, I know that there are probably 3 or 4 other pretty large promoters that do work on par with what LiveNation does here, and ultimately for artists, it's going to be in this new age where the record company doesn't have as much, doesn't wield as much power. Ultimately, these other licensing and ticket brokering services, they're going to have to start offering more kickback or more incentive for the artists to join them. So whether or not, LiveNation is who they go, if I'm an indie band in Brooklyn and LiveNation is offering me a 60% cut of my ticket sales in exchange for a 40% brokering fee or promotional fee. And there are 3 other companies. Their rates are going to be much more favorable to the artists. So I think it will inspire a lot of competition. I don't necessarily know that competitive market exists in a lot of other cities in the U.S., but I think it will quickly surface that way. So
then for a band like the Pumpkins, do you think this will result in the Pumpkins being able to negotiate better deals with their ticket sales?
Probably.
I guess the Pumpkins are kind of a bad example because they have the ins with the Ticketmaster CEO, so they probably already get a pretty good deal on that.
Well, and with regards to what Jill was talking about, LiveNation, we should clarify, they don't just do these large amphitheater arena shows. They are also scaling down into smaller venues. They do own the House of Blues chain, which I don't know if anyone is aware of that, but they did buy them out a year or 2 ago as well, because they're trying exactly so they could get into the smaller 1,000, 2,000 capacity market. With regards to competition, obviously there's a lot of independent, small 500, 1,000 seat venues located city to city. A lot of them don't even have, a large promotional arm behind them. A lot of times it's just the venue. Point in Chicago, the Metro, independently owned, does do some shows with Jam, but they're not 90, but probably 3/4 of the shows that they bring in are things that they bring in themselves. They book, they promote, they do all of that. I think there will always be a smaller, when you get into these small 500, 1,000 capacity venues, there is always going to be that competition because it's not as much money at stake and it's not as much, promotional work that needs to be done. At the same point, if you're a band that's coming up and playing 1,000-person, 1,000 capacity venue show, are you going to want to go with a company where you can move into the 5,000 to 10,000 capacity shows the next time around, or are you going to want to work with an independent venue who might cut you a better deal?
Yeah.
It does give them that added leverage, and I haven't been able to find any substantiated cases of this, but I have heard stories of LiveNation basically offering an absurdly low number, or, an absurdly high guarantee to the artist, selling tickets at a loss because they'll make up the profit on the parking and the concessions because they own all of that stuff. I don't know if that's true or not, but it is a case where since when it's such a large company, they have such a large base to work with versus a small independent artist, where they could basically do that Walmart Best Buy pricing structure of sell something at a loss leader to get people in and then make their money elsewhere.
Now, your point, though, or the point you're not making, maybe, or you are making, but you're making it in a quiet way, is the artist is making out great in that situation, right?
No, the artist would be making out good in that situation, if that is the case, but,
well, you were the one saying it, that you heard it.
Yeah, the artist would be, and a lot of, even these 360 deals, the artists are signing them because they're being offered $150 million lump sum. So, in that case, the artist is going to make a good chunk of change. On the flip side, I could also see, the size of LiveNation and that ability to move into those larger venues being a piece of leverage of saying, well, if you want to play if you want to be able to play an amphitheater any time in your career, you better take this show with us or else, regardless of what we offer you. I mean, not saying that business people would be that unscrupulous and greedy, but you never know.
Well, I think the bands may be getting paid well with these 360 deals, but, as a fan, it's kind of frightening. A 10-year contract doesn't seem to spur experimentation by established artists. And even if the LiveNation won't own the rights to the music, I think all the deals so far, they don't own the rights except for Jay-Z's, I believe they do, was the only one. But even if the label doesn't own those rights, what if in year 3 of the concert, the band says that they're going to tour based around an album that the label doesn't think is going to sell very well, and they won't be able to make a lot of money on an album. They think the tour is going to tank.
Yeah.
What's the label going to do at that point?
You're probably going to throw the album away and pick a better one.
Yeah.
Well, and I also think that the company is pretty volatile as well in assuming that they can actually deliver on a lot of these things. So I think the the impetus is on the company, on the, the potentially merging companies to deliver as well. We've seen some epic failures out of the LiveNation crew in the last few years as well. You cited U2 as one of the artists making a boatload of money off of LiveNation, but at what cost? Well, the story on that was that LiveNation leveraged millions of its stocks to pay U2, and when LiveNation stock tanked because of the market, they had to pay U2 in cash. They bought their shares back, so they were out like $17 million. So it's financially risky for them too. So that's what I'm saying about I would imagine that it inspires competition that self-regulates to find a model that is correct and good. And actually, I did a little reading in terms of like knowing who the competitors would be to a merger like this. There really are very few of them, but they do exist. So like they say that the largest, Bloomberg says that the largest direct competitor of a potential LiveNation Ticketmaster merger would be a company called Anschutz Entertainment Group, and it's owned by Philip Anschutz, who's a billionaire, I think, in California, and they own and operate 130 different venues, including like the Staples Center where the Pumpkins have played. So you may see more large groups like that emerge to gain controlling interest over venues, which I do think directly inspire competition, because at that current operating cost of having to buy back millions of stock, thousands and millions of dollars of stock from artists that they've leveraged as payment, that's not going to work very quick, very well, very long.
On the flip side of that, with AEG, they do own a lot of venues, yes, but how many of those venues probably use Ticketmaster as their ticketing source? So if they do promote a show and put on a show, all of their financial information, everything regarding the ticketing, is going to be going back to this LiveNation Ticketmaster company. And that was one of the things that got brought up in the congressional testimony, whether there would be a division between, promotion and ticketing. I mean, obviously they were going to say that it would be, but wouldn't they be able to use that information to, farther work to not have AEG or whatever large promoters get these shows in the future? Or are these other promoters going to have to develop a whole brand new ticketing system to try and compete with this new company?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, it would seem like if you don't own the venue, if LiveNation doesn't own the venue, this other company, AEG, does, and they want to use Ticketmaster's ticketing system. I mean, isn't Ticketmaster just leaving money on the table if they don't do the ticketing for them? I mean, it's not like they're going to be able to buy the venue in the next 10 minutes or whatever. So.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Ticketmaster is not going to turn them down, but wouldn't they be able to use the information they're getting from that ticketing of that event to, say, the next time the band's coming around 2 years from now, put together a better bid proposal so that they do win the show the next time?
What information, Jeremy? The ticket price? How many tickets there are? Everyone already knows that. What's the secret information they're going to learn?
How much they bid to get the show, how many of the tickets were sold versus given away promotional. I mean,
why? I mean, okay, that second part. Okay. That second part I understand. The part about how much they have to bid, I don't understand why the ticketing company has to learn that.
Well, just in general, if you and I are in direct business with each other, you own a McDonald's, I own a Burger King, am I going to give you all of my sales information and financial information if you're selling the same product?
Well, you're now equating the ticketing with the venue, and you're saying it's the same product, and it's not. I mean, that analogy is just wrong. It would be like the comparison might be you own a McDonald's, I own a Burger King, and we're talking about you also own the company that sells buns for hamburgers, right? I mean, is the bun the product or is the hamburger the product? Well, in the situation we're trying to talk about, we're trying to talk about a bun, and then you're trying to say, oh, it's the same product, it's a hamburger, and a Whopper is not a Big Mac. So, I don't know.
Well, but I think the concern in what I've read, this Bloomberg article that I read earlier this week, talks about specifically what you're referring to, Jason, as raising concern that vertical integration, which what they call vertical integration, which means using dominance in one area like ticketing to control others, such as venue and promotion, regardless of whether or not you know the financials of the venue that you're selling tickets to, using your ticket dominance as leverage to actually control the aspects of the operational aspects of those other aspects.
The only way you can do that is if the way you operate the ticketing is less, right? Mm-hmm. Like you offer you know, your company can, because you run the ticketing, you charge a higher price to the people who aren't you, and say, we can do it for less if you let us own the venue too, right? Yeah. And you say, oh, well, how horrible, but everyone else is getting a better deal because they're charging less. That's the only way you can maintain a monopoly, is charging less. And I know Chris didn't want me to get into economics, but it's like, you know, how oppressed are we by monopolists who charge us less than somebody else would? Not very. You know, you have to start making arguments about, well, they don't innovate or something like that, you know, and those arguments are a lot harder to make, I think. But, you know, the argument that a monopoly is evil when the monopoly is going to be charging fans less and paying artists more is a weird argument to make, and I wouldn't make it personally.
They may not be charging, they may be doing that at first, but I think the argument is that eventually they would push any other companies out of business.
Yeah, that doesn't happen, though. I mean, you know, I hate to call on my expertise and just say trust me, but there isn't a whole lot of historical examples of that ever really happening. It's like a specter that people wave, but, you know, tell me when it's happened. You know, it doesn't happen. I mean, I'm just saying generally. I mean, can you come up with one or two cases? I don't know, maybe, but...
Well, the innovation thing is something that Billy brought up. I mean, he did say that this will lead to new and innovative ways for independent artists to reach their audience. I don't really see how that's the case. I mean, Billy's talked in the past, very recently, about innovative things he would like to do in terms of ticket sales. So, like, for instance, offering fans the ability, in addition to just buying a ticket to a concert, his kind of multi-night package deal, which he kind of piloted that with this during the 20th anniversary tour, but he took it a step further, where he said he's thinking of something like a meet and greet one night, and maybe a dinner with the band another night, and just like a large package like this. I mean, does he maybe see this merger as helping him achieve something like this? Is this something that would help with that?
I do think so. You know, the only sort of comparison, or the most apt comparison that I can make it to in my personal life is, you know, I work in cloud computing. That's my industry right now. Is basically I manage a system that helps my entire business operate, and it does so in an agile way on the web. So I don't have to take care of any of the infrastructure of running a huge IT department, right? So in the Ticketmaster LiveNation merger, what they're doing, and what a lot of artists see them as doing, is basically providing a one-stop shop for a company that's very, you know, well-versed in doing ticketing, promotion, merchandising, recording, you know, all of the sort of administrative minutia of running a band, signing up for that service, and then working on the music. You know, they are the artists, they're going to make the music. So by basically outsourcing all of that hard work around the other stuff that may be not as important to artists, you know, what artist really wants to do, calling all of the venues and booking the tour buses and all that other crap, you know, when they signed up for the band to actually play music and write music and be creative. So I think that a lot of artists see that as outsourcing the IT infrastructure to some extent, outsourcing the administrative infrastructure. So doesn't that free up time to actually be creative, do different things, come up with new strategies?
Isn't that just what a manager does? I mean, every band has a manager. I mean, the manager does all that. Whether the manager has to deal with 5 companies or 1 company, I don't think the band doesn't care. Am I wrong on this, Pins? Or?
Yeah, I mean, they can obviously always hire either a manager or someone to handle any aspect that they need to. I don't think the merger would affect them wanting to do a unique ticketing system one way or the other, unless they're creating all the tickets handcrafted by themselves, like they did for the Doubler shows or something like that. But
but like small independent artists don't have financial means to get a manager. No. Yeah, maybe that's what a manager does. But if you can go to a company, just like I can go to Apple and say, give me a new computer, if I can go to a company and say, give me a promotional tour up package, and put me in a van and take me somewhere, and we'll play shows every night. The cost, the relative cost of entry into the market is much lower.
And how small of an artist are we talking about, though? I mean, if we're talking about an artist that has no success whatsoever, I mean, they're not going to be playing even a 1,000-seat venue, and I think an artist that is playing a 1,000-seat venue can afford a manager. So I don't.
Yeah, I mean, I think the rules are definitely different between a small independent band and a band of the Pumpkin stature that's independent. There's obviously a lot more money and a lot more of a business side to that than 4 people that get together and play a show for 100 people tops. Like, those people are working day jobs too. They don't have time to do any of the rest of that stuff. I mean, there's too much of a split in terms of what you're talking about, but I think for a band that can afford to be, considered a band and be considered popular, they at least have a manager and can probably have some form of label or some support behind them that can handle things that would need to be handled.
Pins, can you try to talk about what you think this is going to mean for the Pumpkins and for the fans? Sure.
Well, for the Pumpkins specifically, I actually can't. There's 2 distinct thoughts that I could have. On the one hand, I think it obviously would be beneficial for them, both because of the frontline and managerial connection, and also just I think they do have enough stature as a touring, industry that they would be able to maybe have a little more say in terms of what they do and how they book to an extent. They're also kind of in that weird middle zone. They're not going to be playing, most likely huge LiveNation only amphitheaters or things like that. So they do have the ability to work with independent venues that are, sell out 2,000 to 4,000 seats. That's kind of the range they're in right now. So it does give them probably a little more leverage room one way or the other, but I don't see them, using that. I see them using their connection with LiveNation to basically, if they do want to play a show and they're trying to get 2 companies in on them, they have an affiliation with LiveNation. If they want to try and get a better deal with the independent one, they have that force kind of behind them because they can use that. So yeah, overall, I mean, Billy's been around a long time. I think he knows enough of the business and knows how to use it to get the band to where he wants to be. I think he's shown that a lot the past year between, basically every business deal that people have been up in arms about. But he knows what he's been doing when he's been doing it. I think he understands it just with his managerial team. I mean, there's a reason he hired these managers in the first place before they even became affiliated with Ticketmaster. These managers were in the industry. They knew what they needed. If they wanted to get the Pumpkins onto a Super Bowl ad or a Visa ad or, onto a K-Rock, almost Christmas show, and people are going to have the pull, they already had the heft behind them to get them what they wanted to do. The one factor where it could hurt them is, obviously they have these, high-powered managers, and those managers can work for them, but the managers are only going to work for them if the band is making them money as well. Frontline management does manage a lot of bands. If at some point Billy falls out of favor, where else is he going to go to? He kind of has to work with what he has he kind of has to work with what he has right now, because without this powerful management team, he may not be able to do everything that he wants to do because the Pumpkins aren't necessarily as popular and as high as they once were. With this merger, if it goes through and Pumpkins and, Paul Geary and Irving Azoff sour on each other, they're kind of going to get cast off to the woods and not have any pull. So as of now, it definitely could hurt, could help them, but it's also going to leave them as kind of the only game in town if they don't, bring money in for their management team and their management starts focusing on other people more. Mm-hmm. It could kind of cause them to be shuffled off more to the side, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And with regard to the fans, I mean, let's be honest, it's not necessarily going to hurt fans a ton any more than they've already been hurt. I mean, people obviously, and I think when this merger was announced, a lot of people focused on, it's making Ticketmaster bigger and badder.
Right.
It's not even that. It's just strengthening the promotional side in LiveNation, where it just gives LiveNation more control. Ticketmaster is not necessarily the bad person. Everyone focuses on the high fees. Everyone hates the high fees, but there is a reason behind them. The reason their ticketing system is probably the best around because of the work they put into it. You know, whether it's ridiculous to pay $250 to print off your own ticket, of course it is, but yeah, that's something they can get away with.
And it's convenient.
Well, exactly, but I mean,
that's what he means when he says they can get away with it.
Yeah,
right.
If the merger goes through, I don't think you're going to see all of a sudden ticket prices or service fees going astronomically higher. I don't necessarily think they're going to drop. They might be a slight fluctuation one way or the other, but it's not going to be that much different. The fan is not going to see that much of a change necessarily, except in possibly a variety of shows. And if the independent promoters get forced out of business, that's the only way where the fan may definitely be hurt, just because there won't be as much variety of things coming in.
Cool. I mean, not cool, but, you know. Thank you for sure.
Yeah.
There's just, I think that what's bothered me the most about this whole situation is how swift both music media and real media outlets jump on the bandwagon of, oh my gosh, too huge company trying to merge, must be terrible. Like, there has been so little critical analysis done that I've seen on any of these websites that, you know, us sitting down for an hour and doing some analysis about it or talking about it, it makes so much more sense to me. Like, shouldn't I be getting this perspective from somewhere not at HU?
Yeah, I hope that the takeaway that people get from this podcast is that the issue is much more complicated than I think that you read. You read that, oh, it's bad, it's big companies merging, and it may be bad, but it's bad in a more complex way than that. You can't just say, well, you know, Ticketmaster charges big fees and LiveNation pays Madonna $150 million for 10 years and you join them together and it's bad. I mean, both of these issues, both of these House resolutions have a lot of nuances to them, and I hope that, I mean, our podcast has gone a little bit long today, but I think it was definitely worth it. I learned a lot too. I came into this podcast being very negative about the merger between Ticketmaster and LiveNation. I mean, I did quite a bit of research on it yesterday, and just reading all this stuff about Ticketmaster and all the shenanigans that they've been pulling off, and LiveNation throwing millions and millions of dollars at these artists that haven't done anything innovative in years. I mean, Madonna, at what point, I mean, she's at the point in her career where she can just kind of tour ceaselessly without putting out a single new album just on the name Madonna alone. But
Right.
I think after hearing all the conversation with you guys about it, the issue is a lot more complicated than that.
Hey, Jeremy, can I ask you something? Or Pins, sorry.
Yeah.
The revenue for big concerts, you know, the big concert industry, not the small concert industry, but the big concert industry, not that you can draw that line easily. Is it down in recent years?
I believe the last report I saw was that the revenue was down slightly, not at, like, maybe it might have been 2%. It wasn't very negligible, or it was very negligible. Right. But on the flip side was also that ticket prices had gone up an average of, I want to say, like $10 to $15. So revenue was actually down. It was just made up with the difference of higher ticket prices.
Yeah, like over the long term
there was less overall attendance, I believe, in 2008 from the report that I remember reading at the end of the year.
What do you know about the long term? I mean, is it like compared to the 90s or the 80s, is it down?
I don't know if I know that. I would have to go back and do a little more research, but I can try and do that and provide that in the comments.
The reason I'm asking is, you know, as an economist, you generally think, you know, if an industry is getting bigger, meaning it's making more revenue, more people are buying stuff from it, it's becoming more important, then you have more companies in it, right? And if it's getting smaller, you have fewer companies, you have consolidation. So just the fact that I see this merger being proposed, I think, maybe the pie is shrinking and the industry is consolidating, you know? And I don't know at all that that's true, though. I mean, that may not be the reason that this merger is happening, you know, but shrinking industries tend to see consolidation. So if the industry is shrinking, then I would expect things like this to happen, and that would be a good reason for people not to maybe be too worried. If the industry is not shrinking and you're seeing consolidation, I might start to wonder a little more about why they're doing it. I don't know.
Well,
pure conjecture here, because I'm not 100% sure. I do know, I want to say that the highest grossing revenues were probably I want to say very early 2000s, and it's maybe been either flatline or, slight up and down since. But, we're talking about something that's obviously an entertainment value, so when the market's good, it's something that people will spend money on. So I would expect revenues to have been down last year, whether that's a symptom of the industry itself or just a fact of people not wanting to spend as much disposable income on expensive concert tickets. It's hard to say long term. I do believe that probably starting in the mid-90s, there has been a large round of consolidation, obviously both in radio stations going back to performance rights. Clear Channel kind of rose to prominence in the 90s, basically by buying up radio stations and these large amphitheater venues, since LiveNation was part of Clear Channel back in the day, and they split, they spun the company off into two separate entities. But in the 1990, 200, 2001 era, where I think it was these largest revenues, Clear Channel did own all of these amphitheaters and these 1,200 radio stations that Jill mentioned earlier. So it was even a larger company then, kind of divested itself, and is now focused purely on radio and purely on touring.
I don't really remember when when Clear Channel spun off Live Nation, were all the music fans like, yes, they've split up. I don't think that.
I think it went out the window and no one even noticed.
Well, that's what I mean. Like, they don't celebrate when companies split up. I think that the general reaction of a music fan anytime there's any sort of industry-related news is to view it negatively. Oh, the business people are doing something. That's bad. It's going to be bad for us no matter what. They split up, it's bad. They get together, it's bad. And it's like rock and roll fans, people who are way into rock music tend to have a leftist sort of political orientation, and leftists, they want to have the government running things, and they don't have much belief in the market system, and that's so I just expect these sorts of things. But that's what I'm saying. If people got mad when things were being monopolized and when there was this vertical integration, I understand that, but then at the same time, shouldn't those same people, if the reason they're unhappy is because of vertical integration, and the reason they're unhappy is because of monopolization, then I would expect that when vertical monopolies break up or spin off, or when competitors arise, people would be like, yay, good. But, you don't see that.
Well, and on that note, Jason, let's be honest. A music fan or rock fan, what are they going to really care about at the end of the day? They want to go to a show that they consider affordable and that's fun.
That's right.
They don't care if it's a monopoly that's doing it, if the monopoly is charging $20. They don't care if it's the small independent promoter. They just want to spend money that they think is reasonable for a show. They want to buy concessions that they think are reasonable. They want to buy a tour T-shirt that they think is reasonable. And they want to see a good show. That's all they really care about.
If only that were true, though.
We're making all these arguments of whether this is good or bad. If the fans are happy, the fans aren't going to care one way or the other. As artists are making money, they're not going to care one way or the other. So it does come down to a political thing, and an economical thing, whether you want to get to that or not. Whether these things are going to be good or bad, it's hard to say. But
right, but in trying, we're always trying to
rock. They want to have fun. That's all they care about.
Absolutely. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to project into the future. Well, does this merger help us rock in the future for less? Can we rock for less with the merger? Yeah, but that's the point.
Live Nation. I'm holding up my lighter right now if you can't see.
Yeah, but so I think what I'm saying though is that people hear the merger, and what's the assumption? We are going to rock less in the future because of this merger, right? And I'm kind of saying, I'm just wanting, I don't know. I think this is funny to think about this Clear Channel spin-off of Live Nation and how that must have led that. Presumably, we were going to rock more. But anyway.
Well, actually, I do want to look into that because I don't remember exactly why it was spun off, but I remember reading a few things of whether there was problems with a radio station promoting the show, that the venue they owned. I don't know. I might just be conjecture on that, but.
Look, I guarantee they spun them off because they thought they could make more money. That's how the market works. But does that mean it's worse for fans? Does that mean it's worse for consumers? It's inconsistent to say monopoly is bad and to say, or vertical integration is bad and to say vertical disintegration is bad. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, and at the end of the hour, the answer is none of us actually do know this, but
that's right.
Whether it happens or not, we'll find out, won't we?
Yeah.
Well, the one thing we do know is that the ultimate worst thing for fans is if both of these companies totally tank and we can't buy tickets for the next 5 years because someone has to ramp up systems in order to do so. Right? I mean, if these companies completely fail, how
Right.
quickly can we get to the rocking again? I mean, I did some research into like the current states of these companies, and oh, it's abysmal.
Chris, will you play the clip from Dross again, just so we can rock out?
Woo!
Oh.
Well, Andrew couldn't make it this week, but this week in Pumpkin's history, the band appeared on WZRD The Wizard in Chicago on March 16th, 1989. Speaking of, local radio stations, terrestrial radio.
That was a really great show.
But their main reason for going there was to promote an upcoming concert appearance and play a set in the studio. It wasn't their first appearance on local radio, but until the archives get opened, it's the one that the fans first got to hear, I think, and the band answered a few questions from the DJ about their sound and their cuts and their upcoming show, but mostly they focused on playing an 11-song mix of tunes that had been in regular Pumpkins rotation for a while, such as Nothing and Everything and Under Your Spell, as well as new additions to their repertoire, such as Rhinoceros, which was a song that we believe this is the first live recording of Rhinoceros, and it's funny to hear the band's reaction to playing the song, considering it went on to become one of the leading tracks in their debut album. The band was not very enthusiastic about playing it at this particular show. But it's also Billy Corgan's 42nd birthday on March 17th of this week, so happy birthday, Billy.
Did we have a party at Tao?
Yeah. I didn't get the invite for that.
So come celebrate his birthday and someone whose birthday is, or someone who's half as old as in his birthday. But they're just friends, according to Wikipedia.
Well, thanks for tuning in this week for what turned out to be quite a long podcast. Leave your reactions and feedback to our discussion on hipstersunited.com. And our song of the week this week is Snap If I Could, from the studios of WZRD The Wizard on March 16th, 1989, long before any talk of 360 deals and congressional appearances, when the band was still just a gleam in Billy's eye.
Pure back then.
It was just about the music back then. Good night, everybody.
Hey, that sounded really great. What was the name? What were the name of those last two cuts?
The first one was a Velvet Underground song, Venus and Furs, and the second one was Snap.
Right. Velvet Underground. That's off the Banana LP. Right.
The Hipsters United podcast is not affiliated with or endorsed by the Smashing Pumpkins, Virgin Records, or Warner Brothers Reprise Records. All opinions offered by panelists or guests of the Hipsters United podcast are their own and do not represent the opinions of the Smashing Pumpkins. All audio during the show is licensed for non-profit use per the terms and conditions on the Live Music Archive at archive.org. Intro music is from the Machina 2 album released for free download on the internet by the Smashing Pumpkins in September of 2000.